Great. Thank you so much, Ari. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm very excited to be with. We have a good crowd today on Super Bowl Sunday. And I would say, even though it's a quarter people of Sephardic background, that's quite large disproportionate representation in terms of the average of the American Jewish population. You know, if you think about it, American Jews are about 2% of the American population, of the U.S. population, and Sephardic Jews are maybe 5 to 10% of the Jewish population in the United States. So we have a good representation here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. The title of my talk is A Diaspora Within a Diaspora, Sephardic Jews in America, and I'm going to be focusing on really the first half of the 20th century and focusing on the primarily Ladino-speaking Jews who came from what was then the Ottoman Empire to the United States at that time. And I want to begin by giving just a little bit of context for how I got into this topic, which is through my own family history. And you're looking right now at a photograph. It's actually the visa photograph for my family when they came to the United States in 1924. This is my great-grandfather. This is my great-grandmother. This is my grandfather, after whom I have his Hebrew name. And my family was from Salonica, or Thessaloniki, which was part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. And shortly before the family came to the United States, it had become part of Greece. And that transition from the end of the Ottoman Empire to modern Greece will be one of the main causes for Jews to leave the region and start coming to the United States, as well as other parts of the world. I got into this because there was sort of a puzzle that I was trying to figure out growing up, and certainly in college, trying to figure it out, how it was that my family came from a part of the world that is now Greece, but had been part of the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire. But the language of the family was a language that was called Spanish, Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, which sounds similar to Spanish, but it's also very different. It's like a Sephardic parallel to Yiddish for Ashkenazim, but therefore it's also written in Hebrew letters. And so it's like, well, how do all these pieces fit together? And it was trying to put those pieces together that sent me on a kind of investigation into the history of the Sephardic Jews. My great-grandfather being a rabbi from the Muslim world, coming to the United States and being the first Sephardic rabbi of a synagogue in New Jersey, Congregation Etz Chaim, which is now in Highland Park, New Jersey. So what is the trajectory, the story that we're going to tell? As you probably know, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and also the conquest of the Americas began that year. And connected to these major transformations in world history, the Jews from Spain were expelled. It was a very prominent Jewish community, and its members dispersed throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. And the largest segment of the Spanish Jewish community wound up finding refuge in the lands of the Ottoman Empire, in the major cities of the Ottoman Empire, including Istanbul, which was the imperial capital, Salonica, now known as Thessaloniki, here Izmir, places all throughout the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Levant, and also parts of North Africa as well. And they transformed the language and culture that they brought with them from the Iberian Peninsula and formulated a new set of communities in the context of the Ottoman Empire, where they lived and thrived and had also their challenges over the subsequent generations. And that story is a topic for a different conversation. I just wanted to focus on emphasizing that by the time we arrive at the 19th and 20th century, Jews in the Ottoman Empire were very much embedded in their imperial context. And one of the ways we can see that, one of the ways that we can see their connection to the Ottoman realm, was in this fascinating kind of artifact that we have here, which is a ketubah, a Jewish wedding contract. And if you see here, what's very fascinating here is, what do we have here? Is we have the star and the crescent. These are the symbols of Islam, and also the symbols of the Ottoman Empire that were emblazoned on the Ottoman flag when it was established in the middle of the 19th century, that goes to show the kind of connectivity between Jews and Muslims and Jews in the Ottoman context. And on the right-hand side, we actually have a prayer in Ladino, in the Sephardic style of Hebrew cursive, known as solitreo, which was used to write the Ladino language, in honor of the Sultan. And this is the traditional prayer in Ladino, translated from Hebrew, Hanoten Hamelech, the blessing for the government. And I wanted to share with you, just to give you a sense of the musicality of the world of the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. Jews, wherever they went, they adopted the cultural practices of their environments. And so synagogue music in Central Europe sounds like general music in Central Europe, and synagogue music in Eastern Europe has an Eastern European flair, and the musical practices of Jews of the Ottoman Empire has an Ottoman feeling to it, a Middle Eastern kind of feeling to it. And here is an early recording of actually the Hebrew of the prayer for the sustenance of the government, of the Sultan here. Can you hear this? You get the idea. This world of Jews in the Ottoman Empire was radically transformed in the early 20th century due to political, cultural, and economic factors, and especially as the result of major wars in the region that would lead to the dissolution, the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, a world of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living in the same imperial orbit will be replaced by a new regime of nation states in the Balkans and in Turkey, and by European colonial regimes in the Middle East, the British in the land of Israel, the French elsewhere, the Italians in parts of North Africa. Going to focus on the Balkans and Turkey right now. And this new entity of the nation state emerged. One people, one language, one religion, one past, a shared destiny. What if you did not belong to the dominant group? What if you did not share their religion or share their language? What would be your future? And this was a question that Jews all throughout Europe were asking in the early 20th century, and it was the problem of not being able to envision a place for themselves in their new countries of residence that propelled Jews all across Europe and the Middle East to leave and to seek new opportunities elsewhere, including the United States. The difference in the case of Jews from the Ottoman Empire is that there was very little anti-Jewish violence that spurred Jewish migration. There was no established history of pogroms. There was no state-sponsored anti-Semitism. There was plenty of state-sponsored violence, state violence in the Ottoman Empire, but Jews tended to not be the targets of that violence. Christians principally were the targets of that violence, most infamously with the Armenian genocide in the context of World War I. But the broader breakdown of the Ottoman world, the rise of the nation state, and an era of war, not only World War I, but wars before and wars after, provoked the migration of perhaps as many as a third of the Jews from the Ottoman Empire to Western Europe, to Latin America, with large numbers also going to the United States, while the doors to the United States remained open until 1924. But the first Jews to flee the Ottoman Empire and come to the United States were not fleeing war, but they were seeking out economic opportunities, and they also came as representatives of the Ottoman Empire. If you can imagine this, at the Chicago's World Fair in 1893, where all of the countries of the world were represented and projecting to the world, what does their country mean? What are their contributions to the world? What is their culture? What is their business like? Jews were there. A firm run by a Jewish merchant was commissioned by the Sultan to represent the Ottoman Empire at Chicago's World Fair. And Jews were there representing the entire Middle East. And here you can see an image of faraway Moses, who is said to have been Mark Twain's tour guide when he went to Istanbul. Here is Rosa, the Turkish dancer. She was actually a Jewish woman. And it was at Chicago where the Ottoman entourage built the first mosque in the United States. And the first mosque in the United States was built by Jews, just in time for them to hold their Yom Kippur services in that mosque. So a really fascinating dynamic emerged here, in which Jews from the Ottoman Empire would not only be representing the Muslim world and bringing the first mosque to the United States, but they would also be introducing things like Oriental rugs and tobacco, and something you probably all have eaten, but the Americans did not know anything about it, yogurt. All of these introductions come through things like the Chicago's World Fair, and the Ottoman presence there, and the disproportionately large representation of Jews in that framework. If you ever had Dan and Yogurt, for example, Dan and Yogurt was established by a Sephardic Jew from Salonica, from the Carasso family. His uncle was a member of Ottoman Parliament. So the numbers of Jews who would wind up coming to the United States from the Ottoman Empire are relatively small in comparison to the overwhelmingly large numbers of Jews who came from Eastern Europe. This map doesn't capture the full chronology, which should be from the 1880s to about 1924, in which there were about 2.5 million Jews who came to the United States, and about 50 or 60,000 Jews from the Ottoman Empire during that period. So they were a relatively small group. Not only were they small, but because, pardon me, they came from a part of the world that was even further away. They came from the Muslim world rather than the Christian world. And they were so different in terms of the Eastern European and Central European Jews who had arrived in much larger numbers. They were oftentimes not even recognized as Jews, either by the United States government or by fellow Jews. They didn't speak Yiddish. They didn't have typical Jewish names. They didn't come from places that Jews were understood to come from. They had different garb, they had different food, different pronunciation of Hebrew, and all of these factors contributed both to a question on the part of U.S. officials about who are these folks, and a question on the part of already established Jews about who are these folks. And we can see this play out here with this observation by an immigration official at the U.S.-Mexico border during World War I. And he refers to what eventually U.S. immigration authorities would call Turks of the Hebrew race. That's how they were described. These are very peculiar people, inasmuch as they are Jewish in blood and religion, are Turkish citizens, and speak Spanish. They do their writing with Hebrew characters, but write in the Arabic language. And some of them did, especially Jews coming from Syria and the Arabic-speaking parts of the Ottoman Empire. Their numbers were even smaller. Some of them did speak Arabic, but the vast majority of Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire spoke Spanish, or Ladino, that they wrote in Hebrew letters. And here you can see the Oriental Spanish Jewish Journal. These were folks that were understood as coming from the Orient, the Middle East, and that term was both descriptive and derogatory. And here you can see a calendar of New York's first Ladino newspaper. Here it says Calendario La La America, and here is like a demonic figure with a sword here, and it says Oriental politics and anti-Semitism, pushing them out and coming to the United States with open arms. The La Libera America is written here, Free America on the Statue of Liberty. The reality would be much more complex than this image would seem to suggest. Because those coming from the Muslim world, what their opportunities and the possibilities of their participation in American society would be like were not necessarily clear from the onset. Would they stay? Many did not. Many returned. Could they become American citizens? And that was something that was actually up for debate. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but probably one of the most important laws in the history of the United States was established with the foundation of the country, with the first Congress of the United States in 1790, and this was the laws regarding naturalization. The Naturalization Act of 1790 indicated that there was only one criterion for a person born in another country to fulfill in order to become a citizen of the United States. And you had to be a free white person. If you were not a white person, you could not become a citizen of the United States. Then that changed after the Civil War, when people of African nativity, black people, could become citizens of the United States. But until 1952, according to the laws of the United States of America, if you were not black or white, you could not become a citizen of the United States. This principally excluded people, Asian people, who were not eligible to become citizens of the United States, but people from the Middle East, people from the Ottoman Empire, their racial status, whether they were white or not, was very much debated in the American context. It was less debated for Jews from Eastern Europe because they came from Europe, and being from Europe was understood as essentially the same as being white. But if you're not from Europe, if you're from the Muslim world, if you're from Asia Minor, if you're from Turkey, are you white and can you become a citizen of the United States? And you can see that the United States government actually set a very firm, pseudo-scientific, racially science, eugenics-motivated hierarchy of the peoples of the world. And this hierarchy will not be so surprising to you because we are still dealing with the legacies of this racist system of understanding the differences between the peoples of the world. So at the top of the officially recognized racial hierarchy of the peoples of the world as adopted by U.S. Congress in 1911, at the top were Northwest European folks, Scandinavian, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, German. At the bottom are black people and indigenous people. In the middle, at the very bottom of the category of Caucasian, are Hebrews and Syrians. And Jews were recognized as a distinct race in the United States until essentially the 1940s, but they were a sub-race of Caucasian, the Caucasian family of races. But just outside of this Caucasian and white category were people of Turkish race. And what is fascinating is that because Jews from the Ottoman Empire were oftentimes not recognized as Jews, they were oftentimes not classified as Hebrews by the US government, and oftentimes they were classified as Turkish, and this would create problems for their ability to navigate American society. And there are some examples, including in Chicago and in Seattle, of Sephardic Jews being denied their petitions to become naturalized citizens of the United States. And no other Jewish group at this time faced similar debates over whether they should count as white. And white here is not necessarily about the color of your skin. It's about how you understand culture, how perceptions about civilizational status, one's ability to contribute to American society and participate in the institutions of democracy. And it was believed at the time that people that came from the Muslim world were just by their nature, this is why it's racist, by their nature incapable of participating in democratic society. Obviously, that's not true, but that was the desire at the time. And so these tensions that were dictated from the U.S. government that marginalized and in some ways targeted Jews from the Ottoman Empire would be internalized and refracted within the broader American Jewish community, because the broader American Jewish community was anxious about these newcomers because of their fears about how Jews coming from the Middle East, coming from the Muslim world, may impact the image of Jews in general in the United States. And so they convened congresses in the times of the Balkan Wars, just before World War I, to figure out what to deal with what they called the Oriental problem in American Jewish life. And here you can see, for example, the way in which they wanted to create distance, the already established Jews, between themselves and the newcomers. The National Conference of Jewish Charities, for example, emphasized the psychic and psychological difference between the Levantine Jew, meaning the Eastern Mediterranean Jew, and our Russian, Austrian, and Romanian co-religionists. So great is the difference that there seems to be little in common. The points of similarity are few. And this kind of tension became apparent to outsiders. So, in the wake of World War I, two well-known American sociologists observed in one of their studies that Levantine Jews, again, Eastern Mediterranean Jews, feel more discrimination from the other wings of the Jews than they do from the non-Jews. And to really emphasize, sharpen this very contentious point, the first so-called academic study of Sephardic Jews in the United States, which was commissioned by the New York Federation through the Jewish Bureau of Social Research, begins his scientific academic study. This guy, Louis Hacker, he's not a nobody. He wound up becoming a dean at Columbia University and a personal friend of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He begins his study by saying that Sephardic Jews are nearly as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen as are, pardon the language, Negroes to the average white Southerner. To make this statement is to make a very sharp division. This is a world in which black people and white people lived in separate spaces, in which black people and white people, by law, could not marry each other. So to make the analogy like this is to really try to emphasize the differentiation, the differences, and from the perspective of already established Jews, a sense of inferiority that would be imposed upon Jews coming from the Muslim world. And that sense of inferiority, that sense of differentiation, often manifests itself in a language around strangeness. And here you can see in a publication that was connected to HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, a profile on the Levantine Jew, also trying to help the readers make sense of these newcomers coming from the Eastern Mediterranean world and the puzzle that they pose to established American understandings of Jewishness. Who are these strangers who can be seen in the ghetto of the East Side, sitting outside of coffee houses, smoking strange-looking water pipes? This is nargila. Sipping a dark liquid from tiny cups. This is coffee, and which comes to the Western world from the Ottoman Empire, by the way. And playing a game of checkers and dice, probably backgammon or sheshbesh, a game that we are not familiar with. See the signs on these institutions. They read Café Constantinople, Café Oriental, Café Smyrna. And there are other signs in Hebrew characters that perhaps you cannot read. Are they Jews? No, it cannot be. They do not look like Jews. They do not speak Yiddish. Listen, what is that strange tongue they are using? It sounds like Spanish or Mexican. Are they Spaniards or Mexicans? If so, where did they get the coffee houses and importation from Greece and Turkey? So Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean world, from the Ottoman Empire, presented a puzzle to already established Jews in a way that was very shocking to the Levantine Jews themselves, because in their cities and regions of origin, they were unquestionably Jewish. They were understood as Jews by themselves. They were understood as Jews by their neighbors. They were understood as Jews by the state. They came to the United States and they discovered that the category of Jew was already taken by a different group that spoke a different language, had a different cultural set of cultural attributes, and this created a lot of tension, as we can see here. What we're looking at here is one of these cafes. This is the Salonica Restaurant and Cafe, which was on Christie Street on the Lower East Side. And if you can see here, it says kasher, because it was a kosher establishment. And the irony, of course, is that despite all of these differences that are described here, this kind of exotic representation of Jews from the Ottoman Empire in the United States, they shared the streets of the Lower East Side and of Harlem together with Eastern European Jews. How did Levantine Jews, Jews from the Ottoman Empire, Jews from Salonica and Constantinople and Izmir, how did they respond to this relatively cold reception that they received, not only in the part of the U.S. government, but also by the established Jewish community? And they did a few different things. One of the tacks that some of the Ottoman Jews took was to disassociate themselves from their place of origin and their place of birth, because they understood that in the American mind and the American Jewish mind, associations with the Islamic world, associations with the Middle East, associations with Africa, associations with Asia were all construed in a negative light in the United States. They were described as Oriental Jews. In the United States, there was a ban on Chinese immigration to this country. People under the Oriental category in this country were completely barred from becoming citizens of the United States. So one of the attacks that Sephardic Jews make is they say, stop calling us Orientals, stop calling us Levantines, call us Spanish, call us Sephardic, call us European, recognize that we too should be classified among the white people of Europe, and make sure that you give us citizenship just like you're giving citizenship to all the other Jews, and make sure that you respect us. So here, part of this campaign, they actually had a campaign in the Ladino newspapers during World War I in which they tried to convince their constituents, the members of the Ladino-speaking communities, to call themselves Spanish, to call themselves Sephardim, to stop using the terms Turkish and Oriental and Levantine in the names of their institutions and publications because of the negative connotations that those terms conjured in the American political and cultural imagination. And one of the arguments here is articulated as such: the Spanish language in the land of Spain are not Oriental, and similarly the official language in Turkey is not Spanish. And we who arrived here to the United States, immigrants from Turkey, were there in Turkey merely as guests for 400 years. So essentially they disavowed the previous very deep connections that they had with the Ottoman Empire. Go think back about that ketubah that had the star and crescent, or the way in which they're singing praises of the Sultan. In the context of the United States, those were all seen as liabilities and detrimental to the prospect of their advancement, participation, and integration into American general society and into general American Ashkenazi Yiddish-speaking society. Now, what's ironic about this statement that the author of this article in the newspaper La America writes in Ladino is that even though he's trying to claim that Sephardic Jews were only guests in the Ottoman Empire, he actually uses the Turkish word for guests, which reveals precisely how connected that Spanish language of the Sephardic Jews became to the Ottoman context. Musafires. One of the arguments that Sephardic Jews will ultimately make is that Columbus, and other Jews will make this, and a lot of other people will make this, develop this theory, that Columbus was a Sephardic Jew, was a Spanish Jew of converso background. The purpose of that argument, by the way, is to try to insinuate Jews, and specifically Sephardic Jews, into the foundational myths of white American society. And what this book, Christopher Columbus Was a Spanish Jew, makes the argument that Americans should have extra special respect for Jews in general, and specifically for Sephardic Jews, because if it weren't for Sephardic Jews, of whom Columbus was one of them, there would be no white civilization in America at all. So you should be thanking us, not excluding us. So this goes to show precisely the vulnerabilities of Jews in general in the United States, and the vulnerabilities of Sephardic Jews, and the lengths to which they went to try to transform their sense of self and identity to integrate themselves into an American narrative and into the racial classifications and hierarchies in the United States. Another tact that Sephardic Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire take in the United States is to try to build bridges with the already established Yiddish-speaking Jewish communities, which are referred to in American Ladino as Yiddishim, los Yiddishim, those who speak Yiddish. Or sometimes they were called Zigizukes. It comes from a Zeigesund, so they heard the Yiddish-speaking Jews saying sei gesund, in terms of your health, and they sort of onomatopoetically referred to them as los Zigizukes. What La America does, the first Ladino newspaper in the United States, is they create a guide for Sephardic Jews coming to America to try to familiarize them with the laws of immigration so they can be better poised to navigate their way once they arrive, especially at Ellis Island, and also to try to prepare them for the Yiddish-speaking Jewish communities that they will encounter in places like the Lower East Side. This is the inside title page, inside cover of the book, which is fascinating because it's for a phonograph, an ad for a phonograph machine, so you could play records. I don't know if anybody remembers those. But what's fascinating here is that it has cantes en todas las lenguas, where you can buy records in all of the languages. What are all of the languages that are relevant to Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire? Español, meaning Ladino, Turco, Turkish, Grego, Greek, Arabo, Arabic, etc. Those are the languages. And this is the first thing that you see in this guide to America is you can get music that will remind you of home. So don't feel so alienated. The guidebook goes on to describe the process of emigración, la emigración, and here is an image of el vapor de la salvación, the ship of salvation that will bring you from the old world to the new world, and you'll get off at Ellis Island, and if you're lucky enough to make it through the gauntlet of Ellis Island, which was known as the Island of Tears, because many people were excluded and not permitted to enter, you arrive in New York City and you will see these huge buildings, bigger than any of the buildings you've ever seen before, and you will see large public parks, and on the corner of the parks you will see people selling this cold, delicious thing that will be familiar for you from the old country, but it will be different because it will be in this little triangle-shaped thing, and that is called, in Ladino, Isaac Macon. And so it tries to introduce the Sephardic Jews to what to expect in the United States. And one of the things that it does is introduces them to Yiddish. And the author of this pamphlet argues in 1916 that in order for Sephardic Jews to become Americans, we need to learn English because that's the language of the country, and we need to learn Yiddish because that's the language of America's Jews. And the Ashkenazim have been speaking Yiddish for 1,000 years, and they're going to speak Yiddish for another 1,000 years. He was only off by like 990 years, basically, before Yiddish stopped being the dominant language of American Jews. But here you can see he has the words in Espanol, in Ladino, written in Rashi script, Alhad, which is how you say Sunday in Ladino. The Spanish word for Sunday is domingo, which has a Christological connotation. So in Ladino, they didn't use that word. They took from the Arabic word wahad, and they made alhad, which is like echad in Hebrew. The first day of the week is alhad. And so they tell you, if you can't read Latin letters, they tell you how to sound it out in Rashi script. So it says Monday, and then it tells you in Yiddish, Sonntag. And it goes through, with all the days of the week, it goes through little expressions here about how to try to navigate your life in the new world of the United States, trying to make contact and make yourself understood, both in terms of the English language environment and also the Yiddish language environment. Although that didn't actually succeed very far, and very, very few Ladino-speaking Jews learned Yiddish. Learning English was a big enough of an obstacle Many of the Jews from the Ottoman Empire came to the United States knowing 5, 6, 7, 8 languages. English and Yiddish were normally not among them. So what else did Sephardic Jews do to try to make a place for themselves in their new environment of the United States, in which they experienced alienation not only from general society, but also from the established Jewish community? One of the things that they did, like all other immigrant groups, is they established mutual aid societies and their own congregations. And so by the end of World War I, there were dozens and dozens of these organizations all across the United States. The vast majority of them, or rather the plurality of them, were in New York City, in Harlem, and the Lower East Side. And then I've listed here for you the other towns across the country that became home to organized Sephardic life of Ladino-speaking Jews in the first part of the 20th century. After New York, the second largest place of settlement for Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire would be Seattle, which would at one point have 3 different Sephardic congregations. 2 of them are listed here, and you can see in the Midwest, in the South, various places, and each of these places have their own distinctive stories and narratives, and I can't get into all of them now, and maybe one day we could do talks about all of these different places, because they're fascinating and very different dynamics. The South is different from the Midwest, is different from the Pacific Northwest, is different from Los Angeles, is different from New York City. All very interesting stories. I'm going to be focusing a little bit now principally on New York, because that was where the majority of the Jews from the Ottoman Empire wound up settling in the early 20th century. But here you can see a list of some of these, some of the congregations. What's also interesting is that the publisher of this, again, it was La America, they didn't necessarily recognize national boundaries, so it also includes organizations for, you can see here, Union Shvat Achim from Havana, Cuba. So they include Cuba here, they include Mexico City, so it's like the Americas, basically, is what they're referring to. One of the organizations that would emerge would be the Salonican Brotherhood of America, which would, after World War I, be renamed as the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And many of these societies initially were organized according to people's places of origin. And this was typical for all immigrant groups. People from Bialystok created their own association. From Minsk, they created a different association. People from this part of Italy created their own association, and people from this part of Greece, they created their own association. So what Sephardic Jews were doing here was not different. What was special about the Sephardic Brotherhood is that it was the first of these mutual aid organizations to open up its doors to people of all backgrounds of Sephardic origin. And here I happen to have for you my family's own application to become members of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America in 1925, shortly after their arrival in the United States a few months earlier. And what's interesting about this document, you can see here they're living in Harlem on Madison Avenue in New York City. And what's here is the languages of the family: Hebrew, Spanish, Greek, and Turkish. And the Spanish means Ladino here. And even though this is written in Latin letters, here you could, my great-grandfather, the Chacham, the rabbi, he signs in Solitreo, in the Sephardic Hebrew script. It says here, Binyamin Chaim Naar. That's the name here. Okay. In addition to these mutual aid societies that provide space and opportunity for Sephardic Jews to develop their own cultural enterprises, to provide aid in times of illness, and to provide burial societies, and to provide religious services, they also develop a very robust Ladino newspaper culture. You're probably familiar with the Yiddish press in the United States. There were dozens and dozens of Yiddish newspapers that had subscriptions of hundreds of thousands of people. The Forward was the largest circulated foreign language newspaper in the United States. At one time, there were more people reading the Forward in Yiddish than were reading the New York Times. But anyhow, in the United States, in New York, there were also quite a number of Ladino publications, weekly publications. La America, I mentioned before. One of the most important ones was La Voz del Pueblo, which was actually a socialist newspaper that catered to the working class criteria of most of the Ottoman Jews who came to the United States. And then there was the most important and longest lasting of the Ladino newspapers, which was La Vara, which began as a satirical newspaper interested in critiquing the U.S. government, in critiquing the people who thought that they were the leaders of the Sephardic community, but were really just a bunch of ish-petirajis, a bunch of people who were posers, essentially. So a very powerful and fascinating newspaper that was published largely in verse. So a lot of the newspaper was, they talked about politics, they talked about news, they talked about community events in poetic form, rhymed poetry. So it's a fascinating, completely unstudied source. I want to mention, because I think it's really fascinating element and something that hasn't gotten any attention before, but is the fact that, as I alluded to, the vast majority of the Jews from the Ottoman Empire, despite they may have been educated in the Ottoman Empire, including as lawyers or doctors, they had to start at the beginning in the United States, and many of them found jobs in the factories of New York City. And they wound up getting involved in the U.S. labor movement because they were working for starvation wages in tobacco factories, in light bulb factories, in electric battery factories. And they essentially became the major producers and laborers in certain aspects of the garment industry on the Lower East Side, which you probably, the shmata business, you probably associate that with Yiddish-speaking Jews. Well, there were also a ton of Ladino-speaking Jews there. And one of the major strikes that took place in the garment industry in 1913 was actually initiated by Ladino-speaking Ottoman-born Jewish women, who gained the attention of former President Teddy Roosevelt, who sympathizes with their plight, and it's in his conversations with these Ottoman Jewish women that help introduce radical transformations to the entire labor industry. The entire industrial labor in the country, and help create later in 1913 the Department of Labor in the U.S. government. So very influential there. And Ottoman Jewish men are very influential in 1916, involved in a citywide battery factory strike. And this political activism brings Sephardic Jews into the Socialist Party. So the first political movement organized in the United States by Sephardic Jews is the Sephardic branch of the Socialist Party of the United States, that eventually is closed down because they come under surveillance from the U.S. government, and the leader of the movement is arrested by J. Edgar Hoover. And when he's about to be deported for trying to promote revolutionary activities in the United States and the rise of the worker, he actually flees the country and clandestinely, and winds up in France, and he comes back later to the United States under an assumed name and has a very low profile after that time. But I want to bring your attention to this very fascinating and completely unknown aspect of American labor history and of Jewish political engagement in the work of the Sephardic Jewish workers in the United States. And one of the most fascinating elements is that eventually some of the Ladino-speaking Jews try to make partnerships with Yiddish-speaking Jews through things like the International Ladies Garment Workers Association, or through the Workers' Circle, and those don't really pan out because of the vast differences that I've already described. But what does wind up developing into a very fascinating partnership is between Ladino-speaking Jews and Puerto Rican workers in the garment industry. And the Ladino-speaking Jews and Puerto Ricans are primarily concentrated. One of their major places of concentration would be Harlem. And one of the reasons why Puerto Ricans wind up in Harlem is because there are already Spanish speakers there. One of the reasons that Spanish Harlem is called Spanish Harlem is because Sephardic Jews were there speaking Ladino, which is like Spanish. So these fascinating connections show us both some of the tensions within the Jewish world and also some of the new opportunities for cooperation that emerged beyond the framework of the Jewish community. Sephardic Jews also began to develop their own businesses and some of them went to school. And one of the businesses that I was fascinated to discover in my own research is this one, La Mejor Groceria Sefaradit in Harlem. The best Sephardic grocery store in Harlem, turns out, was my own family's grocery store. And until I did my research, it wasn't until I came to Seattle that a friend of mine brought to me a magazine from a Ladino magazine published in New York in 1927 that his parents had subscribed to, that had this half-page ad on the back cover. And this is for Naar Hermanos Propietarios, hijos de Rabbi Benjamin Naar, the sons of Rabbi Benjamin Naar. And that's how I know that it's not some other Naar brothers, it's my Naar brothers. See? Okay, merci. Yo estoy aquí dando un discurso. This is my son here, who's Ezra. Puedes salir. Mira, hijo. Well, now we have the new generation here. We have a new generation. This is our guest speaker.
Now I'm in Zoom.
Yeah, you're on Zoom now. Okay. I discovered the 1980s version of this store, which was producing coleslaw and potato salad and stuff like that. But it began in the 1920s in Harlem as an importing delicacies from Turkey and Greece. And here you can see Naranja Pronta Importada de Salonica, which is bitter orange preserves imported from Salonica. So it gives you a sense of their workers, their shopkeepers. Eventually there would be a class of teachers, of lawyers, of dentists, of doctors that would emerge in the 1920s and 1930s. But by that time, and now I'm going to move into the final phase of my talk, the landscape in American society transformed dramatically, because in 1924, U.S. Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, which was the culmination of about 40 years of immigration restriction, and it was initiated at the insistence of a office within the United States government called the Eugenics Records Office, which was the race science department of the United States, which was intent on trying to preserve the Western European, white, and Christian character of the United States. And so it established quotas to limit the arrival of people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, the Middle East, and completely excluded people coming from Asia. There was not really organized border patrol before 1924. You didn't need a visa to come to the United States before 1924. There was no category of illegal alien. All of these things are introduced in 1924. And one of the major motivations, and this is very important to understand, for the introduction of immigration restriction, the main sponsor of the bill, Albert Johnson, was actually a Washington state congressman, declared that Jews are filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits, and that is why immigrants from Eastern Europe need to be excluded to the greatest extent possible. And when President Coolidge signed the Johnson-Reed Act into law in 1924, he proclaimed that he is doing it because America must remain American. And what he meant by that, it was clear to everybody, was that it should remain as white, Northwest European, and Christian as possible. So countries from Western Europe and Northern Europe had much higher quota rates than those from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and certainly those from the former Ottoman lands. What is fascinating is that whereas there were relatively few people coming from Germany, many of the quota spots for visas from Germany went unfilled, whereas there were such expansive lines of people trying to get visas from Poland and Russia and Greece and Turkey. Look at Greece and Turkey, only 100 slots. It was essentially impossible to get into the country. And you can see the impact that this had in terms of Jewish immigration. There was an earlier quota that was established in 1921, so that contributed to the radical reduction here, and then it goes even further after 1924, and only slightly rises under a lot of pressure, and despite the State Department not wanting to let Jews into the country, some are permitted during the context of World War II to come into the country. Now, what's fascinating is that when that immigration restriction law was passed in the spring of 1924, there were thousands of people like on the boat coming to America, probably around 8 to 10,000 Jews, who they got there and they weren't allowed in. They weren't allowed in. Okay. And this had a dramatic ramification for Jews coming from the former Muslim world, the Ladino-speaking Jews, who, like other Jews and like other immigrants who were excluded through the Quota Acts, resorted to other means to enter the country. And in fact, in the 1930s, the group that was most associated with illegal immigration in the United States were Eastern European Jews. But it wasn't only Eastern European Jews who came to the United States through illicit means because they couldn't get in other ways, but it was also Jews from the Ottoman Empire, and including one of my great uncles, who I knew in the 80s and 90s as Uncle Bob, or as he called himself, Uncle Bob. And he was the oldest person I knew. He was the only person I knew born in the 19th century. He was born in the Ottoman Empire. And I remember thinking when I was a kid that, the older the people were in my family, the thicker their accents were. And I associated that with getting old. So like the older you get, the thicker your accent you get. Not that they were older when they came and their language was already set. And I remember thinking, wow, when do you have to get like an accent like Uncle Bob's? Well, it turns out that Uncle Bob, who was the Chazan, the lay Chazan at the Sephardic congregation at Zachaim in New Jersey for 50 years, he could not get a visa to come to the United States. So he stowed away from Salonica to Istanbul, from Istanbul to Cuba, from Cuba to Mexico, and he crossed the U.S. border at Texas under a fake name, Roberto Farias Jr., just to make sure that nobody, claiming to be Mexican in nationality and Mexican in race. And there was a funny loophole in American immigration law. Because of the demands of agribusiness in the American Southwest, they counted Mexicans as white people so that they could freely cross the border, so that they could be cheap labor for agribusiness in the U.S. Southwest. So Uncle Bob walked across the border as a Mexican, whereas being a Jew from Turkey or Greece, there was no way he was getting in. Now, by the time he arrived in 1925, and to the time that he got citizenship in 1932, things had changed. And there was a backlash against the Mexican presence in the United States. And there was a mass deportation of Mexicans that took place in the 1930s. About 500,000 Mexicans, including American-born children of Mexican immigrants who were who were U.S. citizens, were deported en masse back to Mexico. Uncle Bob was in part able to evade this fate because now he changed his story a little bit. And not only did he, if you can see here, it says his former nationality is Mexican, but now he said his former race is Hebrew. And so it became such that it was now more advantageous to be Jewish than it was to be Mexican. And so he was obviously very savvy and knew what to do, and he became a U.S. citizen. And there's only one document I've seen, an official document that I've seen, that says his real identity and his real name. He pretended to be Mexican, and he pretended to use the name Roberto Farias Jr. in the U.S. Census, in his Social Security application, all of his documentation. The only document that says who he really was is his death certificate that says he was from Salonica, Greece. This period of the 1920s and 1930s would also see a new generation of American-born Sephardic Jews entering into American society, going to American schools, learning English in school, speaking Ladino with their parents, but English with their siblings and their children, and even the American Ladino press transforms. Here you can see an ad in Ladino for Pepsi from the Ladino newspaper La Vara on the left. Pepsi Colas es autorizada por usarla en Pesach por la Unión de Congregaciones Judías Ortodoxos de América, which says Pepsi Cola is authorized to be used on Passover by the Union of Orthodox Congregations of America, which is fascinating, which also shows not only are Sephardic Jews consuming American products like Pepsi, but now they're taking the legitimacy of the Ashkenazi Orthodox rabbinic establishment as also a hechsher, a seal of approval for their own processes. And World War II becomes a major turning point because that first generation of American-born Sephardic Jews, the men especially, they've gone to American public schools and they will serve in the U.S. Army. And here you can see an ad for U.S. war bonds in the Ladino press in 1940. And thousands of Sephardic Jews, like other Jews and like other citizens and also non-citizens of the country, served in the U.S. Army. And that would become a real space, the military, of forging a new sense of American identity and a new sense of belonging to the United States. The old country would become increasingly a place of the past. I want to play for you a Ladino song, an original American Ladino song that is about a Sephardic Jewish soldier that goes off to war and needs to write his mother a letter to let him know that he's okay.
Madre, madre querida, sos mi brillo y mi vida. Siempre te voy a escribir por no dejarte sufrir. Siempre te voy a escribir por no dejarte sufrir. Madre, madre.
Okay. As much as they were focused on becoming American, defending their new country, they didn't forsake the places from which they came. And Sephardic Jews in the United States organized and rallied to send money back to their communities of origin during the war and especially after the war to try to rebuild the remnants of their communities. The city of Salonica, for example, the largest of the Ladino-speaking communities in the world, was completely decimated. Of the 50 or 60,000 Jews on the eve of the war, there are about 1,200 who survived. But the Sephardic Jews in the United States, they sent them money that helped them reestablish their homes, that paid for dowries so the surviving women could get married according to Jewish law. And I was fascinated when I was looking through the documentation related to these efforts, they established the Salonica Jewish Sufferers Committee within the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, and it listed all of the contributors. There are hundreds and hundreds of contributors. I'm very fascinated to find my own family listed among the contributors. Here's my grandfather, Devin Naar. This is my great uncle Bob, Robert Fayes. These are almost all my relatives here, either relatives or through marriage. But on the list of the contributors, there are also very other influential families of Sephardic background whose progeny today you might be aware of. Anybody know who this is? This is Hank Azaria, the famous comedian and actor. His grandparents are listed here as well. And Leah Michelle, whose birth name is Sarfati, who is also of a Sephardic background on her father's side. Her great-grandparents are listed here among the contributors. Another contributing family, is anybody familiar with the very famous American pianist Murray Perahia? His family is also listed here. So this World War II moment is a moment of transition and tension. The Sephardic American community is looking to their future in the United States, whereas they haven't completely cut ties with the places from which they came. But the pressures of assimilation, the pressures of becoming white, of becoming middle class, of trying to make it in America are such that in 1948, the Ladino cultural universe essentially comes to an end. As the last Ladino newspaper in the United States, the last Ladino newspaper published anywhere in the world in Hebrew letters was in New York, it folds. But not without a final argument. In one of the last issues of the newspaper in 1948, one of the contributors to the newspaper argues that it is clear that if we want to preserve the Sephardic youth so that they continue their interest in the destiny of their people and their devotion to the Jewish national and spiritual traditions, we must turn to the original source of Jewish vitality among the Sephardim, the Ladino language. We must make good use of Ladino to continue the great and noble Sephardic tradition, the customs and rituals of the Sephardim, and above all, cultivate the solidarity among the Sephardim that today find themselves dispersed in the four corners of the world. It will be of great assistance for the preservation and the progress of Sephardic Judaism in the United States. Unfortunately, this call fell largely on deaf ears, and the appeal and draw of the American homeland, and in 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, and increasing efforts of reconciliation with Ashkenazi Jews would have the upper hand. And almost nobody born after World War II would be born speaking Ladino as their primary language. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. What a terrific introduction to this topic for many of us. And just a few questions in a limited time we have. So please put your questions in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We have limited time. I will follow up this program as I usually do with a link to the recording, some additional reading, and some references from the program. And hope you will enjoy that. And if you have particular questions for Dr. Naar, you can email me and I'll put you in touch as well directly, if that's okay with you, Dr. Naar.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay, so most important question, people want to know what language your son was speaking to you in.
Well, that was Ladino, actually. So we are the only family that we are aware of that is trying to speak to our children in Ladino. So it's a lonely enterprise. So if you have children or grandchildren, and if you may be interested in reclaiming the language, it's not so easy, to be honest, but it is wild to hear my children speaking the native language of my grandparents is really some phenomenon.
Thank you. That was pretty awesome. We did have a CSP event where we did a tour of Salonica, and I'll put that in the list in the follow-up so people can do the history. And we are having a program coming up with Sarah Stein, who wrote a book about the Jewish community of Salonica, and people had mentioned that in the email as well. It's coming up in April. So according to the history that I learned in doing our trilogy of trips to New York, I learned about the origins of American Jewish history, and the Sephardim were here first. 1600s, they arrived. They were followed by the German Jews, then the Eastern European Jews, and each generation that came in kind of looked down on the prior generation. So the fact that the Jews from the Ottoman world had challenges is not new in Jewish history, but I'm wondering, did the existing Sephardic community who was here for so many years, did they interact with the Jews from the Ottoman world?
Yes, it's an excellent question. The short of it is that the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community institutions like Sherith Israel, the flagship congregation of New York City on the Upper West Side, their leadership also looked down at the Oriental Jews and tried to argue that the newcomers should not be called Sephardic because they didn't want to have that association, because they were poor, they were from the Muslim world, they were not European, they were not civilized in the ways that were suitable for participation in American society. So the initial approach was one of distancing that would, by the 1920s, would begin to change. And there would be more interactions and more efforts on the part of the Spanish and Portuguese congregation, especially, I would say, principally through the sisterhood. So the role of women here in building a bridge would be essential, and it would bring the Levantine Jews and the Spanish and Portuguese Jews into closer cooperation. When the head of the Spanish and Portuguese congregation, a very famous rabbi known as David de Solapool, put out essentially a Union Sephardic prayer book, a Sephardic American prayer book. He intentionally excluded the particular practices and customs of the Levantine Jews. So you could go across Sephardic congregations of Eastern Mediterranean background across the country. They wound up adopting de Solapool's prayer book, but many of the congregations would have inserts or extra pages that would be pasted in so that they could preserve their own liturgy, because actually de Solapool was not interested in preserving that liturgy. And it was only really in the 21st century that here in Seattle, Hazani Zakazuz, Isaac Azos, published a new set of Sidurim, of prayer books, according to the Levantine Sephardic customs that restored the liturgy as it had been practiced. So there's both a sense of, again, distance and alienation, kind of paternalism, but also some some bridges that would be established. Like in the 60s, when Rabbi Mark Angel was hired as the rabbi of Shereth Israel, he was of a Rodizli background, of an Ottoman Ladino-speaking background, a child of Seattle. That was controversial, in fact.
Interesting. You touched on some subjects that people have asked about, and we'll try to get there. We have a lot of Seattle people that want to learn about what happened. Why did these Ottoman Jews land up in Seattle? But before we get there, you said you're raising your children speaking Ladino. Are there other customs that you are reintroducing that tie into your Ottoman Sephardi background? And also, are there certain last names that we could look at and know that that's a family from this part of the Jewish world?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, in terms of personally, we're trying to do as much as we can. I mean, with language, it's a challenge, but it's ever present. So it's like all the time I am being Sephardic, because anytime I interact with my kids, I'm speaking to them in Ladino. I mean, with my 5-year-old, I haven't had a conversation with him in English. 6-year-old, excuse me, which is really wild. Foods, we try to prepare foods, borekas we make. We made filas de spinaca the other week. We try to reintroduce some of the other Sephardic practices, like doing a seder for Tu B'Shvat, and sometimes on Saturday mornings I make. We're not so observant. I make what we call challah tostada a la franca, which is French toast made out of challah bread. But then sometimes I will chant for them the Shabbat morning liturgy, and I use the melodies and the makams that I learned growing up from Uncle Bob, and also doing some things in Ladino, like and if I were to go to a synagogue, I would do this, and I did before the pandemic occasionally. If you're at a Shabbat morning service in some congregation or traditional congregations, when they open the Echal, when you open the Ark and about to take out the Sifrei Torah, they pronounce, or they recite Berish Shameh, which is in Aramaic. It's a Kabbalistic text coming from the Zohar. In the Sephardic communities of the Ottoman Empire, they did it in Ladino. So that was something that I learned from my great uncle. It's something I did in my own bar mitzvah. Something that I do now with my own children. The other question was about Seattle.
It was about last names.
About last names. Sure, yeah. I mean, the last names are, in the Ottoman context, they're Jewish names. I mean, so there are a ton of them, and actually some of them are specific, not only Sephardic wise, but specific city wise. So, like my surname Naar, Nun Ayin Resh, is a Salonica name. The name Alhadeff, which is the name of my professorship, or in America they say Alhadeff, or in Atlanta they say Alhadeff, is specifically associated with Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. And so there are many of these names that have, in terms of their linguistic origin, have either Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Turkish, or Greek derivations, we could say, generally speaking. And so each of those names may tell you something about the family's trajectory. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so now big question.
Yeah.
Even before your program, I was getting emails. Please talk about the Jewish community in Seattle and how they got there and what's happening there.
Yes. So in terms of Seattle, the story is that in the beginning of the 20th century, Seattle was a small town, essentially. It was a lumber town. And it was between California and Alaska. And so people were attracted there to that area because of new economic opportunities in the mills, fishing to a certain extent, and also with the gold rush and the opportunities also further to the north. And the story goes that some Greek folks, young Greek men from some of the Aegean islands, Rhodes and nearby, and also from some places near Istanbul, wound up coming to Seattle, and they came back to visit their home towns, and they had Jewish friends, and they let those Jewish friends know about some of the opportunities that were available. If you come to America, you get off and you get on a train and you take it all the way across the country, and before you fall off into the Pacific Ocean, essentially, you get out and there will be some opportunities for you there. And that's what transpires, is that a number of Ottoman Jews from the island of Rhodes and from another island near Istanbul called Marmara and another town near Istanbul called Tekirdağ wind up in Seattle. And initially they associate almost exclusively with Ottoman Greeks, Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians from the Ottoman Empire, because they're also not acknowledged as Jews by the already established Jewish community. They hang out at the Greek cafes. Actually, they get jobs as bootblacks, and the Seattle Times has a fascinating article in 1913 about the first bootblack union in Seattle, which was run by Reverend Charhon, who was actually an Ottoman. He would become a spiritual leader of Seattle, but the Seattle Times calls it the Greek Union, because these Sephardic Jews were so much associated with the Greeks that they were not recognizable as Jews. And over the course of some time, a similar dynamic plays out as the one that I described in New York, insofar as Sephardic Jews will establish their own congregations, and by World War I, essentially after New York, Seattle is home to the second largest Sephardic community in the country. But what's different about Seattle is that Sephardic Jews are way larger, proportionally speaking, to the general Jewish community than they are anywhere else in the world, anywhere else in the country. So that even though there are only a few thousand Sephardic Jews, there are only some thousands of Jews in Seattle. So whereas maybe about 5% of American Jews are Sephardic, about a quarter of Seattle Jews have Sephardic connections. And that story would only continue from there, with Sephardic Jews playing very instrumental roles in developing iconic institutions in Seattle, like Pike Place Market, in fish, and in other industries.
We have so many questions, but we're kind of in overtime. It's like the Super Bowl, and it's tied, and we're overtime, and I can't keep you too long.
Okay.
I have to go watch my sons play in their first basketball program.
Oh my! Okay, you got a lot of.
I'm running out, but I know we're going to have you back. Everybody.
Okay.
We're going to have Professor Naar back. People are like, please have you back. Yes, we'll have you back. We'll do a Q&A session. We'll focus on different topics. We have many people sharing their backgrounds and their stories, how they got to America, which may be similar to your uncles, and it's terrific. I guess the last question I want to end with now is kind of is there revitalized interest in this topic? Obviously, our group here didn't know much about it. Many people here are really appreciative of you sharing the stories and that we didn't know. So tell us about what you're teaching up at UW, and did you have students that are interested? Do you have a lot of kids in your class who are studying this? What's going on today?
Yeah, so I would say there is a dramatic resurgence of interest in Sephardic Jewish history and culture at the University of Washington, and nationwide. I think there are a couple of different factors that contribute to that. I think one of them is, as the United States goes through its own kind of, racial reckoning, I think that's, and discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion and things like that. The Jewish communities are going through a similar process of thinking about the place of Jews of color in Jewish institutions, and also thinking about the diversity of Jewish experiences. And so there are a lot of people who are interested in learning about an aspect of Jewish history, culture, community, their neighbors that maybe they didn't know about, that they hadn't come across before in their studies or in their personal lives. I think that's one set of important factors. And I would say the Zoom dynamics have also provided opportunities for people to connect in new ways. The organization that I alluded to earlier, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, is putting on a lot of different online programs. There's an organization in Washington, D.C., Shin DC, that's putting on Sephardic programs. There's an organization in the San Francisco Bay Area also putting on programs in related to Sephardic topics. So there's a lot of interest that's been generated by virtual connectivity. In terms of the University of Washington, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been trying to establish a major digital library of Sephardic resources. Who can name the most famous Ladino novelist? If anybody can, I would like, who can name a Ladino novelist? I would be surprised if you could. I would be super impressed if you could. But, Ladino was a robust language for all occasions. It was a language of prayer and a language of the home, a language of the street, a language of commerce, a language of politics, a language of journalism, a language of theater. Emma Lazarus didn't write in Ladino, but that's a good try. It's a good. She was of Spanish and Portuguese origin, but writing in Ladino in Hebrew letters. This is what I'm looking for. Not necessarily American, but anybody. We know nothing. One of the guys is Elia Carmona. He wrote over 40 novels in Ladino. He was from Istanbul. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry. So we just don't know anything about this culture. And so one of our goals is to try to bring this culture to the foray. And we've digitized 400 original Ladino books, including novels, that we've collected from people in the Sephardic community, mostly Seattle. But if you have documents related to your Sephardic families, related to immigration, letters in Ladino that you might like to get translated, books, prayer books, anything, please be in touch with me. We'd be very interested in that. And in terms of my classes, there have been a lot of interest. What is fascinating about the Sephardic experience is that the students who take my classes, or we've also offered Ladino as a language. What's fascinating there is the range of students that come to the classes. We have students of Jewish background, including people of Sephardic background, but we also have students of various kinds of Spanish-speaking backgrounds that are like, I can't believe there's this whole Jewish Spanish language. How did I not know anything about it? And then we get a lot of students coming from Middle Eastern or Turkish or Greek backgrounds, Mediterranean backgrounds, there's this interesting Mediterranean kind of Jewish culture that I don't know anything about. So, in our Ladino class, a professor might put an expression on the board, whether it's virtual or in person, and none of the students can read it on their own because Ladino is a mixed language of Spanish and Hebrew and Turkish and Greek and a variety of other different Mediterranean influences. But together, the students collaborating can figure it out, because the student who knows Hebrew can start to sound it out because it's written in Hebrew letters. The person who knows Spanish can begin to understand what it means because it has a Spanish base. The student who knows Greek or Turkish or Italian can then or Arabic can complete the expression. So it's a very fascinating, and Portuguese, yes, is a very fascinating set of dimensions that constitute the language, so much so that we are now in the process of a search for a new professor of Eastern Mediterranean languages, literatures, and cultures, and it is the first search of its kind in the entire United States. And what is also a real unbelievable aspect of this phenomenon is, whereas in most universities across the country, Jewish studies is an exclusively privately funded enterprise, this position is being funded by the university, by Washington state taxpayers, because they see the importance of this culture for the history and present of Washington state, and they see it as a useful and very meaningful way to bring people together across different confessional, communal, and racial boundaries.
Amazing. What a great story. Thank you for sharing today. I note we have some Nars on with you, Barbara Naar and Andrea Naar.
That's my spouse and my mother, so yeah.
Okay, good. Well, you're a close family, good support network to be on there. So welcome to the whole family. You did
thank you very much
for us, and And Rosa Berman, who's one of our relatively new, but supporters in CSP, able to join us because of Zoom over the last 2 years. I play pickleball and racquetball with her son, and they have interesting background with the Ashkenazi Sephardi connection through Turkey and Cuba and so on. So I get to understand much more about the person I play pickleball with, which is awesome. Her son. And look forward to having you back with us on CSP. Please share. I'll email you about sharing us some of these resources and in the Sephardi world today, for example, with people, so I can share the links to our group and this program as well. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Wishing you, as I mentioned, Chag Sameach in America. Hope your team, whichever it is, wins today. And actually, I'm just hoping for a good football game. But more importantly, look how much we learned today, and it's early in the day. So lots to think about. Really, CSP is a jigsaw puzzle, and there are little pieces that help fit in and explain the Jewish world today. And you've given us a great piece to the puzzle.
Great.
Lots to think about. Thank you, everybody. Be safe out there. See you hopefully this week. Take care. Bye.